Some of you may know that UCCF traces its origins back to the late 1890s, where the first student-led group on campus that sought to unite evangelicals together to do outreach was formed in Cambridge. And those audacious students, when they got together to do that in 1877, the first thing that they did was to invite Dwight L. Moody to come to Cambridge to do a university-wide mission. And that's always been our goal, to unite evangelicals for the sake of mission to the campus. Then a key date in the autumn of 1919, Norman Grubb, probably better known for his connections with WEC, with whom I worked in West Africa, he had this vision for a CU, a union of Christians in every university. And by God's grace, in just about every institution across Britain, we now have a university CU seeking to make Jesus known on campus. They're student-led, they're affiliated to their SU, and their goal is to bring the gospel, the good news of the gospel, to a university population that knows almost nothing of Jesus whatsoever. One of our staff and evangelists was describing how he had been preaching about the cross to a group of students and explaining the cross. A student came up to him afterwards and said, you've solved something for me. And he said, what was that? Hoping for a really spiritual, moving conversation. And she said, well, I've always wondered who the diver was. And Nigel said, the diver, what do you mean? And she said, well, you know when people wear jewellery and they have the man like that ready to dive? I've always wondered who the diver was, but now you've explained it for me. So that's how much people know about Christianity. That's how much people understand about the cross and crucifixion. That's just illustrative of a wider trend of people in universities today who know little or nothing of Jesus, who he is, what he came to do, and the life and the grace that he offers the world. And CUs are aiming to make that known. I think this model still has enormous relevance today. I think it's incredibly important that students going up to university unite on campus in order to make Jesus known. Tearfund did a survey of people who are not Christians in 2008, a survey of 7,000 people. And of the student age group, they found that just 2% would go along to a church even if asked by a friend. Just 2%. And so having a Christian community meeting on the campus, access to all the campus, so a student can literally roll out of bed in their hall of residence and go to the CU. The accessibility, the relevance of that, I think is still absolutely crucial in reaching this generation of students and young people. And we seek to do that from the context of a Christian community. And that's incredibly important as well, because the statistics, particularly on student mental health, is concerning. So again, this is an NUS statistic from 2015. 1 in 4 students will seek professional help for mental health issues during their time at university. So that's university counselling services, their GP, and so on. So this is not feeling a bit gloomy for a day or exam stress. This is people with serious mental health issues. The suicide rate on campuses has doubled in the last 8 years. So these are serious issues. So a loving community is absolutely crucial. I was talking to a lecturer at Leicester University the other day, and he was saying how during exam time, to try and de-stress students, they now have people come in and bring puppies. So if you come across this, Josh, yeah, so that students that feel this overbearing stress that if they fail their exams, what kind of career will they have? Life will be hopeless without a decent pass and a decent job. To de-stress, you can go in and stroke a puppy for an hour. So that's where students are today. It's know little of Jesus, all kinds of challenges in terms of health and well-being. So a CU meeting at the heart of campus just makes so much sense, I think, in terms of mission. What I really want to cover today, though, is this subject of just thinking a little bit about today's students and campus culture? Because I'm guessing that, like me, some of us here will have been students a few years ago. Let me ask you what the following have in common. Jenny Murray, you may know her, feminist, broadcaster. Richard Dawkins needs no introduction. Germaine Greer, Brendan O'Neill, editor of The Spectator. Mary Beard, academic at Cambridge. Peter Tatchell, gay activist. Any idea what they all have in common? Yeah, thank you. They've all been no-platformed or banned from speaking at British universities in the last 4 or 5 years. In fact, one survey by the BBC found that almost 2/3 of students say that the National Union of Students is right to have a no-platforming policy that's not giving people a platform to speak at a university. And almost half of the students think the NUS is right to enforce this policy against individuals they believe threaten what they call a safe space. Have people come across the idea of a safe space before? You've probably seen it in the media and in the news and so on. Sarah Bell, speaking to the BBC last year, said the idea that in a free society absolutely everything should be open to debate has a detrimental effect on marginalised groups. Recently, the Vice Chancellor of Oxford University was censured on social media and actually forced to apologise. Her name is Louise Richardson, forced to apologise for saying that her job is not to make people comfortable, but to challenge their comfortableness, to actually make them to think. And students strongly objected to this because that threatened their well-being and their safe space. She said, if you don't like certain views, you challenge them, engage with them, and figure out how a smart person can have such views like that. Work out how you can persuade him or her to change their mind. And she later was forced to apologise and said that my comments, the usual thing, were taken out of context. But that's nothing compared to what Yale professor Nicholas Christakis suffered. He is sociology professor at Yale and master or academic warden at Stillman College. And the issue for him in his college was Halloween costumes. And he was asked by some students to write to all the college saying that any form of costume that involves cultural appropriation, such as dressing as Mexicans or whatever it might be, should be banned by the college in case it causes offence. And Christakis wrote this response: have we lost faith in young people's capacity, in your capacity to exercise self-censure through social norming, and also in your capacity to ignore or reject things that trouble you? What does this debate about Halloween costumes say about our view of young adults, of their strength and judgment? Whose business is it to control the forms of costumes of young people? It's not mine, I know that. If you don't like a costume someone is wearing, tell them you're offended. Talk to each other. Free speech and the ability to tolerate offence are the hallmarks of a free and open society. I'd just like you to watch a clip now of Professor Christakis talking to his students after he'd written that letter. And you can kind of see what's going on a university campus today. Peter, would you mind doing the magic for me? Thank you.
That you guys have not said, I hear you. I hear that you are hurting, and I am sorry that I have caused you to feel pain. I have not heard that from you, and I have not heard that from your wife. And that is what I want to hear. I don't want to hear any more defensive terms because it's not fair to ask.
You seem to think that somehow I don't agree with the content of your beliefs. That's not what's happening from my perspective. From my perspective.
I don't think you agree.
Can I say something? Can I just interject really quickly? The moral of Michaela's comment just now, the moral of the story is that she wants an apology. yet you respond not with an apology.
What if I said to
That's
you-
my
what
question.
if I
I'm just
said to
saying,
you-
are you gonna
what if I
can I finish? Are you going to address the heart of her comment? That's all I want. Are you gonna give an apology? Are you gonna say that you're hearing us?
An unsafe space here for
I
all.
did not-
Be quiet. For all Stillman students. You understand that? As your position as master, it is your job to create a place of comfort and home for the students that live in Silliman. You have not done that. By sending out that email, that goes against your position as master. Do you understand that? Then
No, I
stop.
don't agree with that.
Then
I have a different
you
vision
should
than you.
step down. If that is what you think about being a master, you should step down. It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here. You are not doing that.
You're supposed to be
going
our
against
advocate.
that. You should be at the event last night when you hear a Franco say that she doesn't know how to create a safe space for her freshmen in Silliman. They're gonna leave. They're gonna transfer because you are a poor steward of this community. You should not sleep at night. We're out. We out. You are disgusting.
So you'll see just from that clip that emotions run high. And what you see is two different visions of what an academic community should be. And even Professor Christakis uses the word vision. He says, I have a different vision to you. I want to create a space of intellectual discussion and debate where we can grow as people and human beings. And the students are saying, no, what we need from you is an apology. This is not a safe space. We don't feel at home here. It's irrelevant whether you think you should apologize or not. That's what we need. And therefore you should give it to us. And so he later resigned as master of the college. And interestingly, the press, according to the press at least, a significant number of academics supported him, but were afraid to come out in support because they feared that the student response on social media might damage or even ruin their careers. Now, closer to home at Balliol College, at Oxford this September, the college CU was banned from having a stall at Freshers' Fair. And the JCR Welfare Committee spokesman, Freddie Potts, stated the reasons for this. He basically said that having a Christian Union stall at the Freshers' Fair in Balliol would be an act of microaggression, which might result in some students feeling alienated in the Freshers' Fair environment. He says, this sort of alienation or microaggression is regularly dismissed as not important enough to report, especially when there is little to no indication that other students or committee members may empathise, and inevitably leads to further harm of the already most vulnerable and marginalised groups. Historically, Christianity's influence on many marginalised communities has been damaging in its methods of conversion and rules of practice, and is still used in many places as an excuse for homophobia and certain forms of neo-colonialism. So he says this may be a way of helping to avoid making any students feel unwelcome within Balliol. Rather, the students wanted to create a safe and secular space. Interestingly, this instinct to ban free speech, to ban the existence of CUs, is becoming more and more common and something that we continually have to fight against. Last year at one of the London colleges, one of the most prestigious, in order to create an environment where you weren't under pressure to drink and pair off with somebody, one of the CUs created an event just for blokes and an event just for women. The blokes event was, I think it was a barbecue and video games, and the women's event was a high tea. Now, regardless of what you think of those things, okay, the kind of response by fellow students, particularly on social media, was really shocking. The complaints to the SU included the idea that this perpetuates regressive gender stereotypes and shouldn't be allowed in a progressive institution such as London University. Such stereotypes alienate those that do not fit neatly into them. And as a result, the CU had to pull those events because the threat was an investigation by the SU and closing down of all their other freshers' events. Now, is this just a resurgence of good old political correctness? That emerged in the late 1980s and 1990s in universities. And that aimed to restrict free speech, particularly to free speech aimed at marginalized groups. But it also wanted to challenge the literary, philosophical, historical works and canon that universities used, and sought to widen the perspective. A good example of that would be the movie The Last Supper. I don't know whether anyone's seen that, where if a particular speaker was sought to offend in some way the kind of liberal sensibilities of the university, a bunch of students invited them over to dinner on Sunday night, and if in the conversation this speaker caused offence, they were given the pudding wine, which was laced with arsenic. But interestingly, at the end of the film, they have the shock jock, the shock disc jockey, the kind of right-wing fundamentalist around for dinner. And they think, well, at the beginning they're joking. They say, well, why don't we just start with the pudding wine? Because we obviously know this guy's going to offend everybody, and the world would be a better place without him. Because their reasoning was, look, if someone had got to Hitler in Austria in the 1920s, wouldn't it have been better for the world to just get rid of them? And of course, what the right-wing shock jock does is basically he out-persuades them, he out-thinks them, he out-reasons them, he out-argues them. And so the point of the movie is, now hang on, we've got to be really careful about this idea to close discussion down and restrict free speech. Political correctness has a point up to a point. But this current movement is very different to that. This movement is almost exclusively concerned with emotional well-being. It assumes an extraordinary fragility of the student's psyche, and therefore elevates the goal of protecting students from psychological harm. The ultimate aim is to create a safe space, and you will be punished if you fail to do that. So a lecturer now has to give a trigger warning in case anything that might create unhelpful thoughts, bring to the mind unhelpful memories, is said. That's very common at British universities, and transgressors are mercilessly attacked on social media. One professor wrote an article about this, and he entitled it, "I'm a liberal professor and my liberal students terrify me." And he or she wrote it under a pseudonym because of their anxiety about the attacks they would get on social media. And not even an apology is sufficient. I don't know whether you came across this story last year, but this is Dr. Tim Hunt, biochemist at UCL, who won the Nobel Prize in 2001 for his research. And he made some pretty stupid and inane comments at a conference in South Korea about the need to have single-sex research labs at universities. I mean, they were pretty inane. They were fairly indefensible in my view. But he was absolutely vilified across all social media. Students were refusing to go to his classes and so on. And the outcome was, of course, was that he had to resign. So it's a very different thing from the political correctness that maybe we've been used to in the past. To summarize it, I think we could say the most important thing is creating a safe space where you won't be offended and you won't hear opinions and views that might cause someone harm. Secondly, at heart, it's an issue of identity. Whether it's race, sexuality, gender, to make statements concerning these issues is to put in danger the psychological well-being of students because it's questioning their fundamental identity. Public discourse is binary. You're either on the right side or you're on the wrong side, and there is no middle ground whatsoever. And some protected characteristics trump others. So in the Equalities Act of 2011, there are certain protected categories to do with gender, sexuality, religion, race, and so on. But some are seen as more important than others. And if you happen to be a person that's saying, look, I'm a member of the CU, that's a small marginalized community on campus, your rights are not protected in comparison to the rights of other smaller minority groups. And then lastly, the need to be on message on every single issue. So you might be a feminist, but if you don't support a whole range of issues, you will be vilified. So Germaine Greer is no platformed. So although she's orthodox according to the liberal view on sexuality and on feminism, she's not orthodox when it comes to transgender, because she argues that men transitioning to women are not proper women or not real women. They're something else. And so she's called transphobic. She was banned from speaking at Cardiff University. Or Peter Tatchell is orthodox on every issue relating to this, every single issue, and has fought for equality rights for same-sex attracted people all his life just about. But he signed an open letter to the Observer which said that what we must do is protect free speech. And he was absolutely vilified for that on social media and described by Fran Cowling, the NUS's lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender representative, of being racist and transphobic. So that's the nature of university campus today. You can see some of the dangers in relation to free speech in particular, and therefore the freedom to be faithful to the biblical gospel as defined in the creedal statements, such as the UCCF doctrinal basis. Now, you might say, well, this will pass, the wind will blow this through. But what tends to happen is that what is happening at the university significantly influences culture 15 to 20 years down the line. And the reality is that those people at university are forming their ideas now that will basically stay with them, because no one's got any time after university to do the serious thinking or reading. It's much more difficult. And you see this already. So Philip Schofield and Holly Willoughby, you can't get two more inoffensive people, can you? But did anyone see this clip? A young primary teacher teaching at an all-girls school. A child comes into the all-girls school dressed as a boy. And his parents say, well, what's wrong with that? He's got a woman's body, but inside he feels like a boy. And so he should have the right to freedom of identification and expression and identify however he wants. And the teacher found that really difficult because he's a Christian. And at one point he said, okay, girls, now this is what we're going to do. And the child and the parents complained to the school for not using gender-inclusive language. He was suspended from his job pending an investigation. And he was on This Morning a couple of weeks ago, I think. And what Philip Schofield said was that his views were essentially medieval. Now, you can see what's happening, can't you? Already percolating down to the popular consciousness is this idea that if you stand against this kind of thing, you're medieval. You're against progressive society, and progress therefore means better. Of course, it's not better if you're an old person in a home, or it's not better if you're suffering mental health issues. So this myth of progress we have to question. But you can see what's going on. The gospel is medieval, that we need to have some freedom from because it's so repressive and restrictive. Now, how do we respond to this change in culture and society? What we can't do is vilify it. What we can't do, of course, is mock it. Pascal says this concerning our task. He says, men despise religion, they hate it and are afraid of it might be true. The cure for this is to show that religion is not contrary to reason, but worthy of reverence and respect. Next, make it attractive. Make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. Worthy of reverence because it really understands human nature. Attractive because it promises true good. That's our task. That's my task to university students today. So my task is not to just sort of think this is all ridiculous, they'll grow up or whatever it might be. My task is how I can make the gospel beautiful. to this culture, how I can demonstrate that it's true, how I can show that it really leads to human flourishing and life in this world and the world to come. Now, in order to do that, I need to understand it, where it's come from. Two authors, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, wrote an Atlantic magazine article entitled "The Coddling of the American Mind." And they argued that this comes for the following reason. First of all, there was a surge in crime from the 60s to the 90s, which kind of made everybody anxious. This is in American society. Secondly, there were more stories of abducted children, including putting their photographs on milk cartons, which made everybody afraid, therefore. And so the idea of free-range parenting that was common in the 80s just stopped happening. Rightly so, of course, there was a zero tolerance of bullying. But that, they argue, gave the message that life is dangerous, but we adults will protect you from any harm, whether from adults or from your peers. They identified a kind of increased political polarization between left and right, each demonizing the other, each becoming increasingly angry and unable to have a reasonable, polite conversation. The arrival at college of the first social media natives. So, any idea when Facebook first started? Anyone remember that? Okay, 97. Okay. I had 2004. Yeah, okay. And then in 2006, you could join Facebook when you were 13. And so therefore now, what you've got across universities are people not like me at all, who are entirely enmeshed and embedded in social media. And the thing about social media is that it makes it much easier to join, support and campaign for your moral team, or to shun or attack traitors to your moral cause. And of course, everything exists within an echo chamber, so people read blogs and posts that essentially agree with them. And so therefore, it's increasingly common for what's called click activists to attack people and undermine people that they disagree with without ever having to worry about their ideas. And so these factors have led to this growth in sensitivity, this requirement for a safe space, for us not to be offended. And Haidt goes on, he said, you need to understand how people from a more liberal perspective make decisions. This is quite a helpful diagram, I think, because he basically says that if you look at these thick bars here, this is how people make decisions. And what he argues is that people from a liberal perspective, their major concerns are that harm is not done to people and people are shown care. And then secondly, that oppression is bad and must always be opposed because liberty is always good. And so issues such as, and fairness is quite important as opposed to cheating, but issues like loyalty, authority, sanctity, religion, authority of scripture, loyalty to your tradition, okay, these are much less important. What's really important is stopping harm, stopping oppression, stopping cheating. And so therefore that creates an emotional response. And Haidt argues that what happens is that people have an emotional response to things and then do their reasoning afterwards. And so people make emotional decisions and emotional responses. And he compares this with the social conservative matrix, where these things are perhaps a little bit more balanced, because he argues that conservatives believe that you need institutions, you need a kind of moral narrative expressed in either a religion or some kind of moral code, which then enshrines the morality, keeps it in place, and you need institutions to support it. Because if you get rid of those things, then it's a complete moral free-for-all. And Haidt said that what's essentially happening is that people do emotional reasoning rather than a logical, thoughtful reasoning. And so when you saw the professor outside with the students, you can see the clash, can't you? He's trying to, in a Socratic way, reason with them and say, well, actually, I see it from another, not interested in your perspective, Professor. You've hurt us. And so, therefore, you need to apologize. No, there's another point of view. No, there's not another point of view. There's no other point of view. I'm upset. You've made me upset. You've made me feel unsafe. Therefore, you need to apologize. Now that's really relevant, I think, because in order to communicate, we have to actually understand that people think this way and recognize this. And it's very easy to criticize what's called the snowflake generation, but that won't win a hearing for the gospel. What does the gospel call us to do? I think the gospel calls us to a profound biblical empathy. Let me quote to you from 1 Corinthians 9, which is a passage you'll probably know well. You may want to turn to it. Paul expresses his great concern in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 12. He says, "We endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ." So he wants to make sure that the gospel of Christ can be received without hindrance or obstacle. Verse 19. So he limits his freedom. "Though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant of all, that I might win more of them. To the Jew I became as a Jew in order to win the Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not myself being under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak in order to win the weak. I've become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do this for the sake of the gospel, that I might share with them in its blessing." Now, this is a call to a profound gospel-hearted empathy, isn't it? Paul is free from any obligation to another human being, only to Christ, his Saviour, and he uses his freedom to serve others. He enters, if you like, into the deep story of another culture in order to understand it and appreciate it so that he might communicate with it. And that deep understanding, that empathy with another person's life experience and their worldview is so crucial. Harper Lee puts it well when she says in To Kill a Mockingbird, "You never really understand a person until you consider things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it." What is the deep story of this generation? We need to understand that. A classic secular example, I probably don't have time to really outline this, but in brief, Arlie Hochschild, she's a Berkeley professor, and is as liberal as you can get, but she's left wondering, how did we get to Donald Trump? I mean, some of us share that question. What happened to America? Why did so many people vote for him? And so what she did, she immersed herself in the Tea Party movement in Louisiana, and in order to understand. And she found this. What she said was that, she said, this is how people think. She says that they believe in the American dream. They're waiting in line for their experience of it. But what they see all the time is other people cutting in. Blacks, women, immigrants, refugees, even brown pelicans, all have cut ahead of you in line, she writes. But it's people like you who have made this country great. And you feel uneasy. You've heard stories of oppressed blacks, dominated women, weary immigrants, closeted gays, desperate refugees. But at some point, and she's characterizing the thinking of the Tea Party movement in Louisiana, you say to yourself, you have to close the borders to human sympathy. And that's the deep story, she says. It's what T.S. Eliot called an objective correlative, with a core set of feelings, and it counts. It accounts for your sense of being cut out, your fear, your anxiety, your anger, and your sense of betrayal. And she says, she concludes by saying, there's no hope for the liberal movement unless they understand that, unless they feel it, unless they empathize with it. And she says at the end, she says that, empathy seems to me a tool for really entering a worldview and a perspective at the bottom of which are human feelings. And I actually think you see Jesus do this in a very moving and beautiful way. So just think, for example, of the parable of the prodigal son. And just think to where the prodigal gets to. He's serving the pigs. He eats pig food. He's covered in pig manure. And it's almost as if Jesus is saying to the Pharisees at that point, he's almost saying, do you know what? I understand how you feel. I understand about how you feel about these tax collectors. I understand how you feel about these prostitutes. To you, they're eating pig food. They're covered in pig muck. I totally get that. I totally understand it. That's how you feel about it. I totally understand that the older brother, he's the hero of the story, isn't he? To you Pharisees. But then what Jesus says wonderfully is, look, there's a deeper story still. And that's of a Father who is forgiving and welcoming, and who can even receive back people like this. So I think he actually, by really taking the prodigal all the way down, enters into the world of the Pharisees and says, "Yep, I know exactly I know exactly how you feel about them. I totally get it. But look at this deeper story, a God that you've forgotten, that you fail to recognize." And I think that's what we need to do. We need to identify. We need to empathize. We need to enter in before we can then persuade and invite. Let me just give you a couple of really quick examples. This is, and then we're done. So you can let go of the interested face then. So well done, everyone. So this is Story Durham. This was a university mission held in Durham in 2015 and then in 2016 and then 2017 in February. And the CU at Durham adopted the story of theme for their mission. And let me just run through some of the slides with you. This is all done by the students. What they wanted to do is create a beautiful environment where you could have a lovely cup of coffee, a cheap price, you could have really good food. It was a beautiful environment. It was thought about, it was aesthetic, it had art on the walls and so on. Now they wanted to do that because they said that what we want people to understand, that our God is a welcoming God. And if you wander into this and you think, oh, here we are, Christians again doing things substandard, we want to welcome you with the welcome of the gospel. We want to show you that God is a creative God. So if you're an artist, God gets you, he understands you. We've got art on the walls to demonstrate that. They wanted it to be a welcoming, accepting place. And they told stories, which had great music as well, part of the artist. They told stories, first of all, on social media. And they had stories from people who are Christians. They had stories from people who were thinking about it. They had stories from people who were not Christians. And they posted them on social media on the CU's Facebook page. And these were people that were saying, look, I'm not a Christian. You know, this happened to me in life. That really turned me off. But I think it's good that the CU has this opportunity for us to engage with the story of what Christianity is. And so what that said was, look, even if you're not a Christian, you're valuable. Your story is valuable. And we want to hear what you have to say. We want to hear your experience of life and your experience of living in this world. In other words, it meant that people were accepted and welcomed. And then in the evenings, they interviewed someone who had a story to tell. This is David Wilkinson, who's professor of physics at Durham. So they were looking at his story of being a scientist in a kind of testimony-style interview. And then there was the 25-minute evangelistic talk, really clear evangelistic talk, using the Gospel of John, one of the stories of Jesus engaging with another person. Now, what's really astonishing about that is the response that was generated. So Durham reckoned that between 15 and 20% of the entire student population of Durham went to one of their events in that week. And that's incredible, isn't it? Over 2,500 non-Christians came to an event. They ran events at lunchtime, where they had over 700 to lunchtime evangelistic talk on an issue with questions and lunch over 2 sittings. And every evening they had around 400. And the number of students that they had to follow up was overwhelming. We ran a similar week in Cardiff 2 weeks ago, and they had 98 students who signed up to say, we want to know more about Jesus. That's really interesting, isn't it? It's really interesting. So that rather than taking a combative approach, saying the gospel is true, what you believe is wrong, let me tell you the truth. Okay, it was more of a I'm coming alongside you approach. I want to hear what your life story. And let me tell you a different story, another narrative that you may not have heard, okay, but is actually true in history and leads to real human flourishing, both now and for all eternity. And the results have been really wonderful to see, and we genuinely thank God for that. The other great thing about that, of course, is that the UCCF staff had nothing to do with it. Okay, it was all essentially generated by students. Yeah, isn't that humbling for people like me? Students often have the best ideas. The other thing, just to briefly mention, is this. I don't know whether people have seen this. This is a Gospel of John. This was a staff idea. And it's basically John's Gospel with 6 studies in the back. And the idea is that rather than us shouting aloud the Gospel, we totally believe in public proclamation. That's really important. But using these studies, a Christian can come alongside a non-Christian and say, look, you know I'm a Christian. How about looking at it together? Why not just look at this, and then you consider yourself as an adult yourself whether you think it's true. We could do these studies over a coffee in the back. Would you be interested? And I remember launching this project in 2011 when we launched Uncover Luke, and we produced 7,000. And I thought, what a waste of money. Lord, we've absolutely wasted our time here. Maybe a few hundred students will have a go at this. But interestingly, before we finished that conference in September, the students were texting their non-Christian friends saying, can we meet up? I've got this great new thing. I think you'll love it. You know, by October, we had to print another 8,000. Uncover Luke and then John has been translated into over 30 languages. It's been used all over the world. I heard recently of 30 Turkmen students studying John's Gospel in Russian in Turkmenistan. And that's just astonishing, isn't it? We're so grateful for that. And these studies are put together in such a way that the Christian and the non-Christian are discovering Jesus together through the narrative, through the story. And what we're finding is that for the tough-minded, that gets under their skin. And for the tender-hearted, they find that the gospel is more comforting than they ever imagined. And we're just very grateful to God for that. I've worked for UCCF on and off for 25 years. And we're seeing more fruit than we've ever seen, because there is a hunger out there. There is issues related to people's identity and significance and worth. And just looking at the story mission, 10 years ago, people would have said, no, this is just the Christians trying to hoodwink me, trying to be nice to me, offering me a free lunch. You know, yeah, it'll never work. You know, I've seen through it. Now people think, no, actually, this is an interesting and safe space for me to engage and think and explore. So just to conclude, I would just ask for your prayers for us as we seek to engage students in this way. Don't get me wrong, we're not in any way going soft on the exclusive claims of the gospel. That's essential that we communicate that. Okay, but we need to do it in a way that understands this culture, communicates with it, empathizes with it, identifies with it, but then also enables students to see that there is another vision, a better story, a true story that explains them, their identity, their struggles, and offers the glorious freedom that you have as an adopted child of God through Christ. And that's what we really want to offer students here and all over the world. Thank you.